She was 3 minutes away from saying, "I do," to a man who had already said, "I do," to someone else 6 months ago, and nobody in that wedding hall knew it except the one man who had spent 11 years trying to forget her face. He didn't send a letter. He didn't make a phone call. He didn't ask a single person for permission. He pulled out his phone, called his attorney, and bought the entire building, not the flowers, not the catering, not just the reception hall, the entire building, the parking lot, the deed, every square inch of that property, transferred into his name before the clock struck noon on a Saturday morning in September. And then he walked through those double doors in a plain white shirt with his sleeves rolled up, no tie, no announcement, just a man who had made a decision that could cost him everything, walking toward a woman who didn't even know he was still alive. But before we tell you what happened when those doors opened, before we tell you what she did when she saw his face, and what the groom did when he realized who had just walked in, and what secret was about to destroy an entire room full of people who thought they were there to celebrate love, we need to go back. We need to go back 11 years, to a hospital waiting room, to a girl sitting alone on a plastic chair at 2 in the morning, holding a cold cup of coffee, and waiting for someone who never came, because that is where this story actually begins. And if you think you know where it ends, you are wrong. If this story already has your heart beating faster, do us one small favor before we go any further. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone you love. And drop a comment below telling us, have you ever loved someone and let them go because you thought it was the right thing to do? Because this story is for every single person who answered yes. Now let's go back to the beginning. 11 years before man bought a wedding hall to stop a ceremony, there was a girl named Margaret, though everyone who loved her called her Maggie, and she was 24 years old, and she was sitting in the waiting room of St. Anthony's Hospital on the coldest night of the year, and she was alone in a way that went much deeper than just being the only person in the room. Her mother was behind those double doors. Her mother had been behind those double doors for 6 hours, and the doctors kept coming out with their careful faces and their careful words, and none of those words were the ones Maggie needed to hear. She had called her boyfriend 4 times. She had left 3 messages. She had sent 2 texts. And the phone just rang and rang. The way phones do when someone has made a decision about which parts of their life are worth interrupting their evening for. His name was Douglas. Douglas Hartwell III. And Douglas Hartwell III was at a charity gala that night, in a tuxedo that cost more than Maggie's monthly rent, standing next to a woman named Priscilla, who was the daughter of his father's business partner. And he had put his phone on silent at 8 o'clock because he didn't like the way vibrations interrupted his conversations. Maggie didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the phone kept ringing. She just knew the waiting room kept getting quieter. She just knew that the plastic chair was the hardest surface she had ever sat on, and that the fluorescent lights above her head had a flicker in them that she would remember for the rest of her life. That was when the door opened, not the double doors that led to the patients, the door that led to the vending machines and the parking garage. A man walked through it carrying 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, from the place 3 blocks away that stayed open all night, and he was wearing a jacket that was too light for weather, and his hair was still damp from what must have been a very quick shower, and he stopped when he saw her sitting there, because she was the only person in the room. His name was Cole. Not Coleman, not Nicholas, just Cole, the name his mother had put on his birth certificate, because she believed that people deserved names that fit in one breath, names that didn't need to be shortened or explained. Cole worked at the hospital, not as a doctor, not as a nurse. He was in hospital administration, which meant he worked in an office 2 floors up and dealt with insurance forms and billing disputes and the kind of paperwork that keeps hospitals running even though nobody wants to think about it. He had come back to the office that night to finish a report that was due in the morning, and he had stopped at the coffee shop on his way in because he had learned long ago that late nights in that building went better with good coffee. He was holding 2 cups because the woman at the coffee shop always gave him an extra one. He had never asked why. He had always assumed it was a mistake. He had been carrying a 2nd cup of coffee home for 6 months. On this particular night, he looked at the woman sitting alone in the waiting room with her cold cup of terrible vending machine coffee, and he made a decision. He walked over. He held out the 2nd cup. He said very simply that he had an extra one if she wanted it. Maggie looked up at him. She had been crying, but she had been crying quietly, the way people do when they don't want anyone to notice, and her eyes were red, but her face was composed. And she looked at this stranger holding out a cup of coffee like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She took it. She said, "Thank you." He sat down in the chair 2 seats away from her, not right next to her, not too far, and he drank his coffee, and she drank hers, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was Maggie who spoke first. She said her mother was in surgery. She said she didn't know what was happening. She said she had been sitting there for 6 hours, and she was starting to forget what her mother's voice sounded like, and she knew that was irrational, but she couldn't stop thinking it. Cole listened. He didn't tell her everything was going to be okay. He didn't give her statistics or percentages. He didn't say the things that people say when they don't know what to say. He just listened, and when she finished talking, he said that he worked in this building and that he could go find out what was happening if she wanted, because he knew the night nurses and they trusted him. Maggie looked at him the way you look at someone who has just offered you something you didn't know you needed. She said yes. He came back 20 minutes later with real information. Her mother had come through the first part of the surgery. The next few hours were critical, but the surgical team was good, and they were cautiously optimistic. He had also, somehow, found a blanket, a real one, not the thin paper kind, and a pillow from the supply closet, and he set them on the chair beside her without making production of it. Maggie wrapped herself in the blanket. She looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" He told her his name. Just Cole. Just one word. She told him her name. Just Maggie. Just one word. And they sat in that waiting room together until 4 a.m, when a surgeon came out and told Maggie that her mother was stable, and Maggie put her face in her hands and cried. Not the quiet kind this time, but the real kind, the kind that comes from 6 hours of holding your breath. And Cole sat beside her and didn't say a single word because he understood that some moments don't need words. That was how it started, with a cup of coffee on the coldest night of the year, with a stranger who sat down 2 chairs away and listened. Douglas never called back that night. He called the next morning, apologetic and charming, with an excuse that sounded reasonable on the surface and hollow underneath, and Maggie accepted the apology because she was 24 and she had invested 2 years in this relationship, and she believed that people could be better than their worst moments. But she remembered. She remembered the hospital waiting room. She remembered the flickering lights. She remembered which cup of coffee was warm. Her mother recovered. It took 3 months and 2 follow-up procedures and a long winter of careful living. And during those 3 months, Maggie found reasons to be at St. Anthony's Hospital quite regularly. Checkups, follow-up appointments, a volunteer shift she had signed up for on an impulse. And somehow, without any of it being planned, she kept running into Cole. They had coffee in the hospital cafeteria. They had coffee at the place 3 blocks away that stayed open all night. They took long walks around the neighborhood when the weather got slightly less terrible. They talked about everything and nothing. Her job at the architecture firm where she was trying to prove herself, his growing suspicion that hospital administration was not going to be what he did for the rest of his life, her mother's stubborn refusal to follow the doctor's orders about sodium, his father's stubborn insistence that Cole was wasting his potential. What they did not talk about for a very long time was Douglas. Maggie knew why. She knew that when she mentioned Douglas, something in Cole's face did a thing that it tried very hard not to do. And she told herself it meant nothing. And she told herself they were just friends. And she told herself that the warmth she felt when she saw Cole's number on her phone was just the comfort of a good friendship, and not something more complicated. She was lying to herself. She was lying very convincingly, because she had a lot of practice. Cole was lying to himself, too. He told himself he was being a good friend to someone who was going through a difficult time. He told himself that the particular way he had started cleaning his apartment before she came over was just good manners. He told himself that the way he had started paying more attention to architectural details, reading about buildings, noticing structures, caring about things he had never cared about before just because she cared about them, was intellectual curiosity and nothing else. He was also lying. He was just better at it. This went on for 4 months. For months of coffee and conversations and careful, deliberate almost nothing. And then one evening in April, when the weather had finally decided to become spring, they were sitting on a bench in the park near the hospital, and Maggie was telling him about a project at work that she was proud of, and Cole was listening with particular quality of attention he always gave her, the kind that made her feel like the most interesting person in any room, and she stopped mid-sentence. She just stopped, right in the middle of a sentence about load-bearing walls. Cole looked at her. He said, "What?" She said nothing. She looked at the trees that were just starting to show leaves. She said she had been offered a job. He said that was great. Where? She said Chicago. The air between them changed. It was spring air, and it was still soft, and it shifted in a way that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. Cole said that was a really great opportunity. Maggie said she hadn't decided yet. He said she should take it. He said it with great conviction, and with zero hesitation. The way people say things when they're saying the opposite of what they mean, and they are very, very committed to not letting that show. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Okay." She said she would think about it. 3 weeks later, she told him she had decided to stay. Cole asked why. She said there were reasons. She said her mother was still recovering. She said the project she was on at work was at a critical stage. She said Chicago was very far away. Cole accepted all of these reasons. He accepted them very gracefully. He did not ask if there was a reason she was not mentioning. He did not tell her what he would have said if she had asked him whether he wanted her to stay. He folded the feeling up very carefully and put it somewhere that he thought was deep enough to keep it. What happened next was Douglas. Douglas, who had gotten better about answering his phone. Douglas, who had started talking about the future in ways that included Maggie's name in it. Douglas, who was charming and handsome and well-connected, and who came from a family that had opinions about appropriate matches, and somehow Maggie had ended up in the category of appropriate. Douglas proposed in June. It was a beautiful proposal, rooftop restaurant, clear sky, very good ring. And Maggie said yes, and everyone was very happy, and Cole found out about it through a message she sent him because she was a person who did the right thing even when it was hard. The message said, "I wanted you to know." I said yes. I'm happy. I hope you're happy for me. Cole sat with that message for a very long time. He wrote back, "I am. You deserve to be happy. Congratulations." He stared at what he had written. He added, "He's a lucky man." He sent it. He turned his phone face down. He sat in his apartment, and he was very, very still for a very long time. And then he made a decision. He made a decision that he told himself was the right one, the mature one, the unselfish one. He decided to disappear. Not dramatically, not with a big speech or a letter or a scene. He just started being less available. He let the conversations get shorter. He let the time between messages grow longer. He became a person she had once known, gradually and carefully, like a tide going out. He told himself he was doing this for her. He told himself that staying close to her while she built a life with someone else would be selfish. He told himself a lot of things. Maggie noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a person who noticed everything. She sent messages that were a little too casual, trying not to seem like she was noticing. She suggested coffee with the lightness of someone who was trying not to care too much about the answer. He was always busy. He was always sorry. The reasons were always perfectly reasonable. She stopped asking. She told herself that people drift. She told herself that friendships have their season. She folded that feeling up very carefully and put it somewhere that she thought was deep enough to keep it. This is what people do. They fold things up and put them away and call it moving on. And sometimes they are right. And sometimes the things they put away are the most important things they will ever have. And they will spend years wondering why every room feels slightly colder than it should. Douglas and Maggie got engaged for 18 months before they set a date. The 18 months were fine. They were fine in a way that a meal can be filling, without being particularly memorable. Douglas was attentive when he was present, and absent more often than Maggie wanted to examine closely. He had opinions about her career. Careful, reasonable-sounding opinions about whether she might want to consider a position with one of his father's firms, whether she might want to think about the kind of exposure that came from the right professional associations. Maggie listened to these opinions, and mostly did not take them, and told herself this was normal, that couples negotiated these things, that Douglas wanted the best for her even when his idea of the best and her idea of the best were slightly different shapes. The wedding was planned for September. It was going to be at Hartwell Manor, which was not as the name might suggest, a family home, but a wedding venue that the Hartwell family part owned and had used for 3 generations of family weddings, a grand old building with high ceilings and a ballroom and a garden, and the kind of accumulated history that money can make look like legacy. 800 guests, 3 separate catered events across the weekend, a wedding dress that had taken 7 months and 4 fittings, a ceremony planned down to the minute. Maggie stood in front of her bathroom mirror 3 weeks before the wedding and looked at her reflection for a very long time. She looked at herself the way you look at a stranger you are trying to place. She looked at the dress form in the corner with the white fabric draped over it. She looked at the invitation on the counter, her name and Douglas's name in beautiful calligraphy. She listened to the apartment, his coffee maker, his keys on the hook she had bought for him, his television in the next room. She thought about something. She thought about a hospital waiting room. She thought about a cup of coffee that was still warm. She thought about a bench in a park and a sentence about load-bearing walls that she had never finished. She turned off the bathroom light. She went to bed. She did not sleep. Across the city, actually, much more than the city, because Cole was no longer in the city, had not been in the city for 4 years. Cole was sitting in an office building that had his name on the 37th floor. Not a plaque. The whole floor. The company that started as a hospital administration software idea he had worked on late at night for 2 years had become something that nobody had predicted. Least of all Cole, who had spent the first year of the company's existence being quietly certain that he was about to fail spectacularly. He had not failed. He had, in fact, done the opposite of failing so thoroughly that his father, who had spent 15 years telling him he was wasting his potential, had stopped saying so and started telling people at dinner parties that he had always believed in Cole. Cole had grown up. He had gotten better at suits and worse at small talk. He had dated 3 women in 4 years, each of them intelligent and kind, and not quite right in ways he could never fully explain to anyone who asked. He had an apartment with good light, and a view he genuinely liked, and a refrigerator that was full, because he had finally learned to use a grocery delivery service. He was, by any reasonable measure, doing well. He was, by any reasonable measure, someone who had made good choices and moved forward and built a life. He still remembered her name. He still thought about the way she stopped mid-sentence in the park. He still, and this was the thing he was least proud of, sometimes checked her social media, not often, just occasionally, the way you might check a weather forecast for a city you used to live in, just to know. That was how he found out about the wedding. Not through a message from her, not through a mutual friend, through an Instagram post from a wedding planning account that had been hired to document the preparation, and there she was in a white dress fitting, laughing at something, and the caption said Hartwell Davies Wedding September, and the venue was listed because the venue had its own account that tagged all its events. Cole looked at the photo for a long time. He put his phone down. He picked it up again. He did something. He did the thing that, in a different story, will be the crazy thing, the obsessive thing, the thing that gets explained away as a villain's motivation. But this is not that story. And what Cole did next was not crazy, though it looked like it from the outside. What Cole did was pick up his phone and call his attorney and say he needed information about a property. But that was not what happened first. First, and this is important, this matters, this is the part that changes how you see everything that comes after. First, Cole got a phone call. The phone call was from a woman named Patricia. Patricia was 63 years old, and she had been a paralegal for 25 years, and she had, for years ago, taken a job with a private investigation firm run by her nephew, and she had called Cole because she had been looking into Douglas Hartwell III on behalf of a client. She had called Cole because Cole's name had come up, not as a suspect, as someone who might want to know what she had found. Cole said he didn't understand why his name had come up. Patricia said it had come up because someone had told her that Cole was the kind of person who would want to do something with this information, and that someone had been his friend Marcus, who was a hospital administrator and who had stayed in touch with Maggie's mother, who was named Ruth. And Ruth had once mentioned Cole's name to Marcus with a particular tone of voice, and Marcus had put 2 and 2 together and made a phone call. Cole said what information? Patricia said that Douglas Hartwell III was legally married, had been legally married for 6 months, to a woman in Connecticut named Vivian, who was the daughter of a business partner, who had agreed to a very quiet ceremony in January, who had been told by Douglas that the other woman in his life was a temporary situation that would be resolved quietly before anyone had to know anything. Cole was very still. He said, "Are you certain?" Patricia said she had the marriage certificate. She had photographs. She had text messages, obtained legally, that made the situation completely unambiguous. Cole said thank you. He sat with this information for exactly 12 minutes. He had always been precise about time when it mattered. Then he called his attorney. He did not call Maggie. Not yet. He had thought about why, later, and the reason was not calculation, not strategy. The reason was simpler and more human than that. He had a fear, a very specific fear, that if he called her and said Douglas is not who you think he is, she would hear it the way people sometimes hear bad news about the people they have chosen to love. She would hear the source before she heard the message. She would hear the 11 years and the drifted friendship and the maybe of everything they had never said out loud, and the information would be contaminated by the carrier before it could land. He needed her to see it. He needed it to be undeniable. He needed it to be the kind of truth that no one in that room could talk around or minimize or delay. He also needed, and this is the part he was honest with himself about, sitting alone in his office with a view he genuinely liked. He needed to see her. He had been missing her for 11 years with the consistency of a person who does not know they are waiting for something to end, and something inside him had recognized, when he saw that Instagram photo, that the thing he'd been waiting for was a moment when the waiting would resolve itself one way or another into a real answer. He was not buying the building to get the girl. He was buying the building to give her the truth. He was buying the building because it was the only way he could think of to make certain the truth arrived before she said words that could not be unsaid. That is what he told himself. In the 12 minutes before he called his attorney. That is exactly what he told himself. Whether he was entirely right about his own motivations is something only the rest of the story can answer. The attorney's name was Howard, and Howard had been doing very complicated things with Cole's money for 3 years, and when Cole called him at 7:15 in the evening and said he needed to acquire property by morning, Howard was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would need more information. Cole gave him more information. Howard was quiet for another moment. Then he said that this was either the most romantic thing he had ever heard or a significant fiduciary liability. And Cole said he was aware, and Howard said he would make some calls. Hartwell Manor was not actually owned entirely by the Hartwell family. It was a holding company situation, 3 investors, a management company, the Hartwell Family Trust as the largest shareholder, but not the only one. This was, from Cole's perspective, useful. It meant there was no single family decision-maker who would refuse on principle. It meant there were people involved whose interest was money and not sentiment. Howard worked through the night. Cole worked beside him, not on the acquisition, but on something else, on the information, on how to present it, on what needed to be in that room, and what needed to happen when he walked through those doors. By 6 in the morning, Howard called and said it was done, not done in the permanent transfer of all assets sense. Done in the sense that Cole had acquired controlling interest sufficient to have the legal authority to make operational decisions about the venue, effective immediately. The full acquisition would take weeks of paperwork. The right to walk into that building and make a decision about what happened there. That was done. Cole put on the white shirt. He rolled up the sleeves. He did not put on a tie. This was not a performance. This was not a statement. He just did not want to look like he was coming to make a speech. He wanted to look like a man who had been awake all night, doing something important, and had come to finish it. He took the folder Howard had prepared. He put it in the car. He drove. The wedding was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Cole arrived at 9:45. The parking lot was already full, not with guest cars. Guests didn't arrive at 9:45, but with floors, vans, and catering trucks, and a particular organized chaos of an event that had been planned down to minute for 18 months. People with clipboards and headsets in very specific jobs were moving in all directions, and none of them paid attention to the man in the white shirt who walked through the service entrance like he knew exactly where he was going. He did know exactly where he was going. Howard had given him a floor plan. The wedding coordinator's name was Diane, and Diane was the kind of professional who had seen absolutely everything in 22 years of event coordination, and when a man in a white shirt walked up to her and said that he needed to speak with her as the new operational authority for this venue, Diane looked at him with the expression of a woman who had also seen every variation of unwanted wedding disruption. Cole showed her the paperwork. Diane looked at the paperwork. She looked at it for a long time. She was a professional, so her face did not change very much. She said she would need to make a phone call. Cole set a course. Diane made 3 phone calls in quick succession. After the third one, she came back. Her face had changed slightly. She said, "What do you need?" Cole said he needed 15 minutes in the ballroom before the guests arrived, and he needed someone to bring him to the room where the bride was getting ready. Diane said the bride was in the Magnolia Suite, which was where brides always got ready at Hartwell Manor, and that she would take him there. But she needed to know what his intentions were because she had a duty of care to the people at this event. Cole said he understood. He said his intentions were to prevent a woman from making a permanent legal commitment to a man who was already legally married to someone else. And he took the second folder from under his arm, the one with Patricia's documentation, and he showed Diane the marriage certificate. Diane looked at the marriage certificate. She looked at the photographs. She closed the folder. She said, "Give me one moment." She stepped aside and made a 4th phone call. Cole could not hear what she said. He could see her face. He watched something in her face make a decision. She came back. She said, "Follow me." The Magnolia Suite was on the 2nd floor, and the hallway leading to it was decorated with flowers that had been arranged early that morning, and the smell was extraordinary. The particular concentrated sweetness of hundreds of flowers in an enclosed space, and Cole walked through it and did not notice the smell at all because he was thinking about what he was going to say. He had been composing what he was going to say for the entire drive. He had been composing it in some form for 11 years. He had made speeches in his head. He had written things down and deleted them. He had a very clear idea of all the things he absolutely could not say, and a much less clear idea of what was left after you removed those things. He had decided in the car that he was going to say only 2 things. He was going to say, "There is something you need to know," and then he was going to hand her the folder. Everything after that was going to be her choice. Everything after that was not his to control, or manage, or plan. Everything after that was going to be real, and whatever real looked like was going to be the answer. Diane knocked on the door of the Magnolia Suite that a voice from inside, not Maggie's, said, "Just a minute." The door opened. A woman looked out. She was holding a hairpin, and she was wearing black, and she had the specific look of a bridesmaid who had been awake since 5 in the morning managing things. Diane said there was a gentleman who needed to speak with the bride, briefly, on an urgent personal matter. The bridesmaid looked at Cole the way people look at unexpected things that arrive at inconvenient times. From inside the room, Maggie's voice said, "Who is it?" The bridesmaid looked at Cole. Cole said his name. Just Cole. Just one word. There was a silence from inside the room. The silence lasted long enough to be significant. Then Maggie's voice said, "Let him in." The bridesmaid stepped aside. Cole walked in. The Magnolia Suite was large and bright, and there were flowers here too, and there were 3 other women in the room who all looked at Cole with various expressions ranging from confused to concerned, and Maggie was sitting at the vanity in her wedding dress, looking at him in the mirror. She was beautiful, not in the way she had been beautiful at 24. She was 35 now, and the beauty had deepened, settled, become something more permanent than the beauty of a young woman. She had her mother's eyes. He had always noticed that, large and dark and capable of significant feeling. Her hair was up. Her dress was everything the dress at a wedding this elaborate was supposed to be. She looked at him in the mirror for a moment. Then she turned around. Her face when she saw him was complicated. There were several things in it. There was surprise, because she had not seen him in 4 years and had not expected to see him here. There was warmth, because whatever else had happened between them, the warmth had never entirely gone away. There was caution, because she was a perceptive person, and she could see that he had been awake all night, and that he was holding a folder, and that something was happening that she did not yet understand. She said, "Cole." He said, "Maggie." She looked at the other women in the room. She said, "Could you give us a minute?" It was not really a question. The women filed out. Diane closed the door. They were alone. Cole crossed the room. He handed her the folder. He said, "There is something you need to know." She opened it. She looked at the first page. The marriage certificate. Douglas Hartwell III and Vivian Calloway. January 14th of this year. He watched her face, read it. He watched her read it again. He watched her turn to the photographs. He watched her go very still. He said nothing. He had promised himself he would say nothing after the two things, and he kept the promise. Maggie sat very still for a long time. Then she closed the folder. She held it in both hands, in her lap, and she looked at the floor, and she was absolutely silent. Cole waited. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Since last night." He said he had received a call from a private investigator who had been looking into Douglas on behalf of a different client, and that as soon as he knew, he came. She said, "You bought the building." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you just call me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said because he needed her to be able to see it, not just hear it, and because he was afraid that if he just called, something might prevent the information from arriving the way it needed to arrive. She looked at him. There were things in her face that he could read, and things he couldn't. She said that's not the whole reason. He was quiet. She said, "Cole." He said no. It wasn't the whole reason. She looked at him for a very long time. Then she looked back down at the folder. She said she needed a moment. He said, "Of course." He turned to give her privacy. In a room this size, there was not much privacy to give. But he turned toward the window and looked out at the parking lot filling up with the cars of 800 guests, and he waited. He heard her take a breath. One long, deliberate breath, the kind you take when you are making a decision. He heard her stand up. He turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room in her wedding dress, and she was looking at him with her mother's eyes. And whatever she was feeling was large enough that she was holding herself very carefully, like a person carrying something that might spill. She said she needed to make some phone calls. He said, "Of course." She said she needed him to wait outside. He said, "Of course." She said, "Cole." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for coming." He nodded. He went to the door. He opened it. He was almost through it when she said his name again. He stopped. She said, and her voice was different when she said it, lower, more careful. She said she needed to ask him something, and she needed him to be honest. He said he would be. She said, "Why did you stop being my friend?" The hallway was quiet. The flowers smelled like everything. Cole stood in the doorway of the Magnolia Suite on the morning of the wedding. He had just bought a building to stop, and he looked at the woman who had been carrying that question for 4 years, and he decided to stop lying. He said, "Because you're going to marry someone else, and I couldn't be your friend and want what I want at the same time, and I thought disappearing was less selfish than staying." Maggie looked at him. He said he was sorry. He said it sincerely, not as a preamble to anything, not as an opening to a conversation, just as a genuine apology for a genuine wound he had caused. She nodded. She said, "Okay." He went into the hallway. Diane was waiting at a discreet distance. He went and stood near the window at the end of the hall, and he looked out at the September morning, and he waited. He did not know what was going to happen. He did not know what she was going to decide. He had delivered the truth. He had apologized. He had told her the real reason. Everything after that was real, and he had no more control over it than he had over the weather. Inside the Magnolia Suite, Maggie sat back down at the vanity. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked at the folder. She opened it again, looked at the marriage certificate, closed it again. She thought about Douglas. She thought about 18 months of engagement. She thought about the careful, reasonable-sounding opinions about her career. She thought about phone calls that went to voicemail. She thought about a woman named Vivian in Connecticut. She thought about how you could be in the middle of a life and still have a feeling that you were living slightly to the left of where you were supposed to be. She thought about a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room. She thought about a warm cup of coffee on the coldest night of the year. She thought about a bench in April and a sentence about load-bearing walls she never finished. She thought about an Instagram post and a man who had been awake all night doing something insane and necessary and true. She picked up her phone. She called Douglas. Douglas answered on the second ring, which was unusual. He was probably in the building by now, probably in the groom's suite 2 floors down, probably surrounded by his groomsmen and his father and his perfectly planned morning. She said, "Douglas, I need you to tell me about Vivian." There was a silence on the other end of the phone. Douglas said what? She said she had the marriage certificate. She said she needed him to tell her the truth. The silence was longer this time. She could hear him breathing. She could hear in the background the sound of other voices going quiet. Douglas said it was complicated. Maggie said a lot of things are complicated. This is simple. He said he could explain. He said if she just let him explain. She said there's nothing you can explain that changes what I'm holding in my hand. He said Maggie. She said goodbye. Douglas. She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she called her mother. Ruth answered immediately. Because Ruth always answered immediately. Because Ruth was a woman who had raised a daughter alone and had learned long ago that when your child calls, you answer. Maggie said, Mama, I need to tell you something. Ruth said, What, baby? Maggie said the wedding wasn't going to happen today. Ruth was quiet. Then she said, Are you all right? Maggie said yes. She said she would explain everything. She said she needed Ruth to come to the Magnolia Suite right now because she didn't want to be alone. Ruth said she was already in the building. She had been in the building for an hour, and she was on her way. Maggie put the phone down. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time. Something in her face had changed. The woman in the mirror looked sad, genuinely sad. Not the collapsed kind of sad, but the standing up kind. The kind that knows what it lost and also knows it did the right thing. She looked like a person who had just closed a door that had needed closing for a long time. She also looked, and this was quieter, like a person who had just opened a window. She stood up. She walked to the door. She opened it. Cole was at the end of the hallway. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at her face. He read it the way he had always read her face. Carefully, with the full attention he always gave her, the kind that made her feel like the most interesting person in any room. She looked back at him. She said, I need to tell 800 people that the wedding is off, and I have no idea how to do that, and I would really like some help. Cole looked at her for a moment. He said, I own the building. I'll handle the announcement. Maggie almost laughed. Not quite. The morning was too much for quite laughing, but almost, a sound that was something between a breath and a laugh. She said, Of course you will. And they stood in the flower-scented hallway of a building that Cole had bought in the middle of the night to deliver a truth, and the September morning came through the window at the end of the hall, and everything that was going to happen next was unknown. And that was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly right. But here is where you think you know how this ends. Here is where you think the story is. Man buys building, saves woman. They live happily ever after, credits roll. You are wrong. Because Maggie had walked out of that suite, knowing what she did not want. She did not yet know what she did want. And Cole had told her the truth about why he disappeared. But telling the truth and being ready for what comes after the truth are not the same thing. And Douglas Hartwell III was 2 floors down in the groom's suite, and his father was with him. And his father was not a man who accepted closed doors. And Ruth, Maggie's mother, who had come through those hospital double doors 19 years ago and had raised a daughter to stand up in rooms where everyone expected her to sit down. Ruth was walking down that hallway right now, and the look on Ruth's face when she saw Cole standing at the window was something that requires its own telling. And in Connecticut, a woman named Vivian was sitting in a kitchen with her morning coffee, watching her phone. And across the city, in the office of a private investigator's firm, Patricia was looking at a photograph that she had not yet shown anyone. A photograph that was not about Douglas at all, but about something that happened 4 years ago. Something that connected Cole's name to Maggie's life in a way that neither of them knew about. This is not the end of the story. This is where the Rayall story begins. Ruth came around the corner of the hallway and saw Cole standing by the window, and she stopped walking. Ruth was 61 years old. She was a small woman, not quite 5'3", who gave the impression of being considerably larger when she was feeling something strongly. She was wearing a mother of the bride dress in deep blue, and her hair was done, and she had been in this building for an hour helping with things and smiling at people and carrying something in her chest since the moment she had walked through those doors that she had not allowed herself to name. She looked at Cole. She looked at him the way a woman looks at someone she has thought about a great deal without ever saying so. Cole looked back at her. Ruth said, Cole. Cole said, Mrs. Davies. Ruth said, How long have you been here? Cole said, About an hour. Ruth said, And you came because of Douglas. It was not a question. Ruth had always been like that. She asked questions she already knew the answer to because she wanted to hear how you answered them, not because she needed the information. Cole said, Yes. Ruth looked at him for another moment. Then she walked past him toward the Magnolia Suite, toward her daughter. But she paused when she was even with him, just for a moment, and she said, very quietly, so that only Cole could hear, "I told Maggie about you once. About a man named Cole who brought her coffee in a hospital waiting room when she was 24 years old and alone. I told her that was the kind of man worth knowing." Cole didn't say anything. Ruth said she knew, and then Ruth kept walking. And Cole stood at the window looking out at 800 people who had arrived to see a wedding and were about to hear something very different. He had a job to do. He had told Maggie he would handle the announcement. He had meant it. He straightened his sleeves, the white shirt, the rolled-up cuffs, and he walked toward the ballroom. The ballroom of Hartwell Manor was the kind of room that people design other rooms to imitate. High ceilings with original plasterwork. Tall windows that let in the morning light at an angle that was almost embarrassingly beautiful. Flowers everywhere. Because this was a wedding, and the wedding had been planned by professionals who understood that more flowers was always the answer. The guests were beginning to come in. Not all of them. It was still 40 minutes before the ceremony. But the early ones, the punctual ones, the people who sat in the front rows and had feelings about being there before everyone else. They were taking their seats, talking to each other in the warm, low murmur of people who have come to celebrate something. Diane was at the door of the ballroom. She looked at Cole with an expression that said she had been doing this for 22 years, and this was in the top 3 of difficult mornings. Cole said, "I need the microphone." Diane said, "The ceremony microphone is set up at the front. The officiant has it." Cole said, "I'll need it before the ceremony starts. I'll need it in about 20 minutes. Diane said, "Mr. Cole, there are 800 people in this building, and the groom's family has significant ownership history with this property, and I need to understand exactly what you are planning to say before you say it." Cole said, "I'm going to say that due to circumstances that have come to light this morning, the ceremony will not be taking place, that guests will be directed to the reception for refreshments and transportation assistance, and that all vendors will be compensated in full for their time and services." Diane looked at him. She said, "That's it?" Cole said, "That's it." Diane said, "What about the groom's family?" Cole said, "What about them?" Diane said, "Victor Hartwell is in the building. He knows something is happening. He has made 3 phone calls in the last 20 minutes, and he sent someone to the bride's suite, and that person was not allowed in. He is not going to accept this quietly." Cole said, "I understand." Diane said, "Do you?" Cole said, "I own the building, Diane." There was a pause. Diane said, "Yes, you do." She handed him the microphone controller. Victor Hartwell was 67 years old, and he had been the kind of man who got his way his entire life. Not through cruelty, necessarily. Cruelty was for people who needed others to fear them, and Victor had never needed that. He got his way through a combination of money and patience, and the absolute conviction, maintained through 67 years of evidence, that the world arranged itself according to the preferences of people like him. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with white hair and the kind of suit that communicated, without saying anything, that the person wearing it existed in a different category of material reality than most of the people in any given room. He had arrived at Hartwell Manor at 9:15 that morning, and he had spent the subsequent 90 minutes in the Manor's private lounge with 3 of his associates and a very good glass of something, conducting what was essentially a business meeting using the wedding as context, when his associate Marcus, not the hospital administrator Marcus, a different Marcus, Victor's Marcus, came back from the Magnolia Suite saying that someone had turned him away at the door. Victor felt the first edge of something he recognized as disruption when his lawyer called to say that controlling interest in Hartwell Manor Holdings had been transferred to an entity called Cedar Point Ventures, LLC, effective that morning. Victor had felt the edge become something sharper. He found Cole in the hallway outside the ballroom. Cole had been expecting this. He had been expecting Victor Hartwell since the moment he signed the paperwork. He had thought about Victor Hartwell during the drive and had decided, in the particular way he decided things under pressure, quietly, completely, without drama, that he was not going to be moved. Victor Hartwell stopped in front of him. He looked at Cole the way powerful men look at people who have done something they didn't sanction. It was a look that had ended careers in silence rooms. Cole looked back at him with the patience of someone who had spent 11 years building something and understood that not everything was solved by the biggest voice in the room. Victor said, I don't know who you are, but you need to understand what you've walked into. Cole said, my name is Cole. I acquired an operational controlling interest in this property this morning. I'm sorry for any inconvenience to your family. Victor said, my son is getting married in this building in 40 minutes. Cole said, no, he's not. Victor said, excuse me. Cole said, there's some information your son should have given everyone before today. Since he didn't, someone else had to. I'm sorry it happened this way. Victor said, whatever you think you know. Cole said, I have a marriage certificate. Your son and a woman named Vivian Calloway. January. This year. Victor stopped. The stop was very small, just a fraction of a second, just a fractional change in the way he was holding himself. But Cole saw it. Cole said, you knew. It wasn't a question. Victor recovered very quickly. He was a man who had been recovering very quickly from unexpected moments for 67 years. He said, this is a private family matter, and whatever documentation you think you have. Cole said, I'm not interested in a conversation about documentation, Mr. Hartwell. I'm interested in making sure that a woman who deserves the truth has it before she makes an irreversible decision. That's done. The rest of it is yours to deal with. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The look had changed. It was still powerful, still the look of a man who was accustomed to arranging the world. But there was something else in it now, a calculation. The kind of calculation that very smart men make when they realize they are dealing with someone they underestimated. Victor said, what do you want? Cole said, nothing from you. Victor said, everyone wants something. Cole said, I want the woman in that suite to not spend the rest of her life married to someone who is already married. That's what I wanted. I got it. Victor looked at him a moment longer. Then he said, very quietly, my son is an idiot. Cole said nothing. Victor said, this will be very complicated to clean up. Cole said, I imagine so. Victor said, you're not going to make it easier. Cole said, no. Victor turned and walked away. His walk was still the walk of a man who owned rooms, but the room had changed. Cole watched him go. Then he turned back to the ballroom. It was time. The microphone was at the front of the ballroom, near the arch of flowers where the ceremony was supposed to happen. Cole walked up to it. The room was maybe a third full, 300 people, roughly, with more arriving. A low hum of conversation. The particular warm expectancy of people who have come to see something good happen. Cole tapped the microphone. The room quieted. He said, good morning. My name is Cole, and I am the current operation authority for this property. I need to share something with you on behalf of the bride's family. Due to circumstances that have come to light this morning, the ceremony scheduled for today will not be taking place. The room changed. The warm expectancy turned into something else. Confusion, concern, the particular shocked quiet of a large group of people trying to process unexpected information simultaneously. He said, all guests are warmly invited to remain for refreshments in the reception hall, and the venue staff will be happy to assist with transportation arrangements. All vendors and service providers will be fully compensated. We ask for your patience and your kindness toward everyone involved. He said, thank you. He put down the microphone. He walked out of the ballroom. Behind him, the room erupted in the sound of 800 people trying to understand what had just happened. He could hear it as he walked. The rising tide of voices, the confusion, the concern, the shock, the particular sound of a gathering that has lost its reason for gathering and is trying to find something else to be. He walked back to the hallway. Diane was there. She said the groom's suite had just become very loud. Cole said he imagined so. She said Douglas's groomsmen were asking for the event coordinator, and she was trying to manage it. Cole said she was doing a great job. She gave him a look. It was a complicated look that contained, among other things, the admission that this was in fact the most interesting thing that had happened to her in 22 years of event coordination. Cole went back to the window at the end of the hallway. He stood there. He waited. The waiting was different now. It had a different quality. He had done the thing. Everything he had been able to do was done. The folder was in her hands. The announcement was made. The building was his, for whatever that was worth. The rest of it, The real part, the part that mattered more than any of the logistics, was in the hands of a woman in a wedding dress on the other side of the door, talking to her mother. He waited. In the Magnolia suite, Maggie sat on the floor. She had not planned to sit on the floor. She had sat down in a chair when Ruth came in, and Ruth had sat down in a chair next to her, and they had talked, real talk, the kind between a mother and a daughter who have learned over years of necessity to say the true thing. And somewhere in the middle of the true things, Maggie had slipped off the chair and sat on the floor, because the chair felt like too formal a place to be when your life was rearranging itself. Ruth sat on the floor with her. Ruth was 61 years old, and she was in a mother of the bride dress, and she sat on the floor of the Magnolia suite, without a word of complaint or ceremony, because Ruth was that kind of mother. Maggie told her everything. Douglas, the marriage certificate. Cole, the building. The conversation in the hallway. The reason Cole had disappeared 4 years ago. Ruth listened to all of it. She asked one question when Maggie finished. How do you feel? Maggie thought about it. She said, I feel like a house that just had its foundation checked and discovered one of the walls wasn't load-bearing. Ruth said, which wall? Maggie said, the one I thought the whole thing depended on. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know what you do when you find out a wall isn't load-bearing? Maggie said, what? Ruth said, you take it down, and you see how much bigger the room is. They sat on the floor of the Magnolia suite for a while. Outside they could hear, distantly, the sound of 800 people receiving unexpected news. They could hear the faint vibration of a building going through a change it had not been scheduled for. Maggie looked at her dress. She said, this cost 7 months and 4 fittings. Ruth said, it's a beautiful dress. Maggie said, I don't know where I'm going to wear it now. Ruth said, somewhere better. Maggie leaned against her mother. Ruth put her arm around her. They sat like that, mother and daughter, on the floor in a building that had just been bought by a man who brought warm coffee on cold nights. And outside the window the September morning continued doing what September mornings do, which is be beautiful and melancholy and completely indifferent to any of it. Maggie said, Mama, did you know about Cole? The way he felt? Ruth said, I suspected. Maggie said, why didn't you say anything? Ruth said, because you weren't ready to hear it, and I knew that when you were ready it wouldn't need saying. Maggie said, I'm ready now. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know, baby. Maggie stood up. She helped her mother up off the floor. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The dress, the hair, the face that had changed since this morning. And she said, I need to go talk to him. Ruth said, yes, you do. Maggie said, what do I say? Ruth said, you'll know. You always know. Maggie walked to the door. She opened it. She went into the hallway. Cole was at the window at the end of the hall. She walked toward him. He heard her and turned. They stood facing each other in the September morning light, in the flower-scented hallway of a building that had changed ownership overnight, and the distance between them was about 10 feet, and it had the particular quality of a distance that has been many years in the making. She said, you stood at this window for a long time. He said, yes. She said, were you waiting to see what I decided? He said, yes. She said, what did you think I would decide? He said, I didn't let myself think about it. I just waited. She looked at him. She said, Cole. He said, yes. She said, you bought a building. He said, yes. She said, that's insane. He said, I know. She said, you've been insane your whole life, and I didn't notice. He said, you were busy noticing other things. She took one step toward him, then another. Then she was close enough that she could see the way his face had been awake all night. The particular texture of exhaustion that comes from caring about something enough to not sleep. And she could see what was in his face, all of it, the thing he'd been folding up and putting away for 11 years, visible now with a particular clarity of something that no longer needs to be hidden. She said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. He said, always. She said, 11 years ago in a hospital waiting room, when you brought me coffee, were you in love with me then, or did it happen after? He was quiet for a moment. He said, I brought coffee. I sat down. You said your mother was in surgery, and I went to find out what was happening. And when I came back and saw you wrapped in that blanket, I thought, this is the person? She said, that fast? He said, "That fast? But I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't know what to do with it. I was 26 years old, and I worked in hospital administration, and you had a boyfriend, and you were the most alive person I had ever met. And I thought, just be her friend, just be that. That's enough." She said, "It wasn't enough." He said, "No." She said, "You should have told me." He said, "Yes." She said, "You had years to tell me." He said, "I know. I was a coward about it. I thought I was being unselfish. I think I was actually just scared." She looked at him with her mother's eyes. She said, "What are you scared of right now?" He said, "Right now? Nothing. I've been awake for 31 hours, and I bought a building, and I told you the truth, and I'm standing in a hallway with the most alive person I've ever met. And I'm not scared of anything right now." She took the last step. She put her hand against his chest. Not an embrace, just a hand, against his heart, the way you might check if something is real. He looked down at her hand. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that, in the hallway, in the September light, in the flowers. She said, "I'm not ready to say anything big. I want you to know that. I just ended an engagement. I have 800 people downstairs eating canapes and being confused. I have a dress on that I need to eventually take off. I'm not in a place to say anything big right now." He said, "I know." She said, "But I want to have coffee with you." He said, "I have a place 3 blocks from St. Anthony's that stays open all night." She almost laughed again, more than almost this time. A real sound, brief but genuine. She said, "I remember." He said, "I know." She lowered her hand. She stepped back. She looked at him. One long, complete look. The kind that takes inventory of a person and decides what to do with what it finds. She said, "Meet me downstairs in an hour. I need to deal with some things first." He said, "I'll be there." She turned. She walked back toward the Magnolia Suite. He turned back to the window. Outside, the September morning was still doing its beautiful, melancholy, indifferent thing. Cars were starting to leave the parking lot. Some guests had decided the refreshments and confusion were not what they had come for. Others were still inside, still trying to understand. He could see Diane below, moving between vans with her clipboard, managing the elegant collapse of an event she had spent months helping to build. Cole stood at the window and breathed. He was 37 years old. He had spent the night buying a building, and most of the morning delivering truth to a room full of people who didn't want it. He was tired in a specific way. The tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from a particular effort of being completely, unreservedly honest after years of practice at the opposite. He was also, and this was the thing he was most careful about, the thing he didn't let himself feel too fully yet, because he was a person who had learned caution, he was also something very close to hope. Not hope like a wish. Hope like a direction. Hope like an open window in a room that has been closed too long. He was going to wait downstairs. He was going to drink the worst coffee in the building, the vending machine coffee, because the catering coffee was for an event that was no longer happening, and he was going to wait for an hour, and at the end of that hour, something was going to happen or it wasn't, and he was going to be okay either way, because he had done the true thing, and the true thing had been done, and whatever came after was at least built on real ground. He believed this. He mostly believed this. He went downstairs. What he did not know, what nobody in that building except Patricia knew, because Patricia was the only person who had the second folder, the one she had not yet shown anyone, was that the story was not finished turning. Patricia was not in the building. Patricia was in her car in the parking lot of a coffee shop 4 miles away, on her 3rd cup of terrible coffee, with a folder on the passenger seat and a decision she had been postponing for 24 hours. The folder in Patricia's car was about Cole, not about Douglas, not about Vivian, about Cole, specifically about what had happened 4 years ago, in the month before Maggie's mother Ruth had gone into the hospital the second time. Not the first time, the night in the waiting room, but the second time a year later, when it had seemed for 3 terrible weeks like Ruth might not come through, and Maggie had been sitting in a different waiting room in a different hospital, and a different set of bills had come that she couldn't pay. Patricia's folder contained documentation of an anonymous payment, $112,000, transferred through 3 intermediary accounts to the billing department of Mercy General Hospital, applied to the outstanding balance on the account of one Ruth Margaret Davies. The payment had been made 4 years and 3 months ago. The same month that Cole had started drifting away. The same month he had become too busy to have coffee. Patricia had found it while she was looking into something else entirely. She had flagged it because the routing was interesting, and her nephew had taught her to notice interesting routing. She had traced it back to its origin. She had been sitting on it for 24 hours, trying to decide whether it was relevant. She had decided, at 6 o'clock this morning, that it was very relevant indeed. She was trying to decide whether to bring it inside. The thing about this piece of information was that it changed the shape of the story. It meant that Cole had not simply drifted. It meant that in the month he had started being too busy for coffee. He had also quietly, anonymously, without telling anyone, paid off $112,000 of debt for the mother of the woman he was in love with, and then disappeared, because he had apparently decided that staying was asking for something he had not earned a right to ask for. It meant that his disappearance was not just cowardice. It was also care of the particular kind that doesn't announce itself, that pays the bill and walks away. Patricia put her coffee down. She picked up her phone. She called Cole. Cole was in the lobby of Hartwell Manor, standing near the vending machine with the worst coffee. When his phone rang, he looked at the number. He answered. Patricia said, "I have something I need to tell you." Cole said, "Okay." Patricia said, "I found something while I was looking into Douglas. I wasn't looking for it. It came up because of the routing on a payment. And I want to make sure you know that I found it before I decide what to do with it." Cole was quiet. Patricia said, "It's about the hospital bill. Ruth Davies, Mercy General, for years ago." Cole was quiet for a long time. He said, "How?" Patricia said, "The intermediary accounts were clean, but not completely clean. I'm good at my job." Cole said, "Who else knows?" Patricia said, "Right now? Just me." Cole said, "What are you going to do with it?" Patricia said, "That depends on what you tell me right now. Are you going to tell her?" Cole thought about it. He thought about it with the particular care he gave the things that mattered most. He said, "Yes." Patricia said, "Today?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, then I'm going to shred this file." He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "Yes, I do, because it's not my story to tell. And if you're going to tell it, you need to tell it yourself without documentation, without evidence, without it looking like you're proving something. You understand?" Cole said, "Yes." Patricia said, "She's a smart woman. She's going to ask you why you didn't tell her at the time." Cole said, "I know." Patricia said, "Do you have an answer?" Cole said, "I'll figure it out in the next 50 minutes. Patricia said, "Good luck." She ended the call. Cole put his phone in his pocket. He stood at the vending machine, and he thought about what Patricia had just told him and what it meant and what he was going to say, and the lobby moved around him with the organized confusion of an event in the process of being dismantled, and somewhere upstairs in the Magnolia Suite, Maggie was taking off a dress she had spent 7 months and 4 fittings on. He had 50 minutes. He got the terrible vending machine coffee. He sat down in a chair in the lobby. He drank the coffee. He thought about how to tell the truth about a thing he had done in the dark and never expected to be asked about. Here is the thing about the payment. Here is what Cole had never told anyone. Not Howard, not Marcus, not his father, not anyone. He had found out about Ruth's bills because of an oversight, a hospital billing oversight, the kind that happens sometimes, a misdirected account summary, a file that ended up in the wrong inbox. He had been working late. He had seen the number. He had recognized the name. He had not thought about it for very long. He had not weighed the ethics of it or considered the optics or worried about what it meant or how it would be received. He had just done the thing. He had the money. His company had just completed its first significant funding round, and he had more money than he had ever had in his life, and it had seemed, in the 3 o'clock quiet of a late night, like the most obvious thing to do with some of it. And then he had done the other thing. He had faded away. He had become too busy. He had, in the particular language of cowardice dressed as nobility, decided that he had no right to stay close to someone he loved when he wasn't ready to say so, and that paying a bill in the dark was not a claim on anyone's life. It was just what you did when you could. He sat in the lobby and drank terrible coffee, and he thought about how a person explained something like that. He thought about how you say, I loved you from a hospital waiting room, and I paid your mother's bills because I was awake at 3 in the morning and had the money, and it was the only thing I could do that felt true. And then I disappeared because I thought that was better than staying and wanting something I hadn't earned. He thought about how that sounded. He thought about whether it sounded like love or like something with a worse name. He decided it sounded like love. Badly managed, imperfectly expressed, self-defeating love. But love. The only kind most people ever manage. He finished the terrible coffee. He waited. Maggie came downstairs 47 minutes later. She had changed. Not back into the dress. The dress was folded carefully in a garment bag that a Magnolia suite attendant was holding with a particular reverence of someone who has been told something is important. Maggie was wearing what she had arrived in that morning. Dark jeans, a cream-colored top, a jacket that was both practical and beautiful in the way only certain jackets manage to be. Her hair was still up, but differently. Not the ceremony hair. The real hair, the way it looked when she had pinned it herself without a team of professionals. She looked like herself. Not the bride. Herself. Ruth was with her. Ruth was also changed, back into clothes she had arrived in. And she was carrying her own bag, and she stopped when she saw Cole sitting in the lobby chair with his terrible coffee. She gave him the look again. The look that contained, "I've known about you for a long time." She said, "Cole." He stood up. He said, "Mrs. Davies." Ruth said, "I'm going home. I'm going to make real food and sit in my own house." Maggie, she looked at her daughter. Maggie said, "I'll call you tonight." Ruth said, "I know you will." She looked at Cole again. She said, "Take care of her." Cole said, "Always." Ruth walked out of the building. She walked like a woman who had spent the whole morning holding herself together and was about to let herself fall apart a little in the privacy of her own car, on the way to her own house, where she was going to sit in her kitchen and drink tea and think about all the ways that terrible things can end up being exactly right. Maggie sat down in the chair across from Cole. She said, "Hi." He said, "Hi." She said, "You have the worst coffee I've ever seen." He said, "It's from the vending machine. It costs 75 cents. She said, "Why are you drinking it?" He said, "Because the good coffee is at the place 3 blocks from St. Anthony's, and we haven't gotten there yet." She looked at him. A pause that contained several things. She said, "Tell me something I don't know about you." He said, "How much time do you have?" She said, "I have a canceled wedding in a Saturday afternoon and no particular obligations. I have all the time." He looked at her. He made the decision that Patricia had helped him arrive at. He said, "There's something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you decide what to think about it." Her face went careful. Not closed careful. Ready? He told her about the billing oversight. He told her about the late night and the number and the name. He told her about the money, what he had done, how, and why he had done it without telling her. He told her everything except how much it was. He left out the number, because the number wasn't the point. Maggie listened. She sat very still, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, with a quality of attention that meant she was hearing not just the words, but the space around the words. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How much?" He said, $112,000. She was quiet for a little longer. She said, "And you didn't tell me." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it wasn't a loan. And it wasn't a gift I wanted acknowledged. It was something I could do and you couldn't, and your mother needed it done, and I didn't want it to be a thing between us. I didn't want you to feel obligated or grateful or complicated about it. I just wanted her to be okay." Maggie looked at the floor. Then she looked up at him. She said, "And then you disappeared." He said, "Yes." She said, "Because you thought staying would be asking for something." He said, "Yes." She said, "Cole." She said his name like it was 2 syllables made of something heavy and something light at once. He said, I know how it sounds. And I'm not telling you this because I want credit for it or because it changes anything about what I owe you in terms of just being present and telling the truth. I'm telling you because you should know the whole thing. All of it. And because I think you've spent 4 years thinking I left because I didn't care, and that's not what happened." She looked at him for a very long time. She said, "My mother has been fine for 4 years." He said, I know. She said. She takes care of herself now. She follows the sodium restriction. She walks every morning. He said, I know. She said, you know because you checked. It wasn't a question. He said, not often, just occasionally. She made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, and it wasn't quite a cry, and it wasn't quite something else. It was the sound a person makes when something has turned out to be much larger and much more complicated and much more true than they were prepared for. She said, I need coffee. Real coffee. He said, it's 3 blocks from St. Anthony's. She said, I know where it is. I've been going there for 11 years. He looked at her. He said, you kept going there. She said, it was always the best coffee. A beat. He said, shall we go? She stood up. He stood up. They walked together through the lobby of Hartwell Manor, past the florist beginning to dismantle the ceremony flowers, past the catering staff managing the complex logistics of an event that had become a different kind of event, past Diane, who looked up from her clipboard and watched them go with an expression that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but somewhere in a space between, the space where 22 years of being present at other people's most important days had built its own kind of feeling. They walked out through the front doors of the building. The September morning was still doing its thing, cool and clear and slightly melancholy, the way September mornings are. The parking lot was considerably emptier than it had been 2 hours ago. Somewhere across the lot, a florist van was being loaded with flowers that had been arranged for a ceremony that had not happened. Maggie stopped on the front step. She looked at the morning. She took a breath. Cole stood beside her. She said, I was going to ask you something in the suite, and I didn't finish asking it. He said, okay. She said, that morning in the park, April, 11 years ago, I stopped in the middle of a sentence about load-bearing walls. You asked me what I was thinking, and I said nothing. He said, I remember. She said, do you know what I was actually thinking? He said, no. She said, I was thinking that I had been talking to you for 4 months, and every conversation felt like the most important conversation I had ever had. And I was thinking that I had a boyfriend who I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and I was sitting on a bench in a park with a man I had met in a hospital waiting room, and I was thinking that I was in trouble. Cole was very still. She said, I was thinking that I was in trouble, and I didn't know what to do about it. And the safest thing I could do was keep talking about load-bearing walls and pretend I hadn't just thought what I thought. He said, Maggie. She said, and then 3 weeks later I told you I wasn't in Chicago, and you asked me why, and I gave you 3 reasons that were all true and none of them were the real one. He said, what was the real one? She looked at him. The September morning was all around them. The parking lot was emptying, and the florists were working, and somewhere in the building behind them, the careful machinery of dismantlement was proceeding, and in the middle of all of it, a woman in dark jeans and a cream-colored top stood on the front step of a building a man had bought overnight and said, I didn't go to Chicago because I didn't want to be 3 hours away from you. Cole stood on the step next to her. He said, 11 years. She said, 11 years. He said, we're very stupid people. She said, extremely stupid. He said, I'd like to not be stupid anymore. She said, I would also like that. Starting now. He put his hand out. Not an embrace. Not yet. Just a hand. Extended. The way you extend a hand when you are asking someone if they want to come somewhere with you. She looked at the hand. She looked at him. She put her hand in his. They walked down the front steps of Hartwell Manor together. They walked across the parking lot, past the florist van, past the leaving cars, past the September morning doing its thing, and they turned left at the end of the parking lot, in the direction of St. Anthony's Hospital, in the direction of a coffee shop 3 blocks away that stayed open all night, toward real coffee and a bench in a park somewhere and a sentence about load-bearing walls that was finally, 11 years late, going to get finished. But here's where the story has one more turn. Here is the thing that was waiting around the corner. Here is what neither of them knew was about to happen. Because the best stories never let you off the hook before the last surprise. Douglas Hartwell III was standing at the end of the parking lot, not with groomsmen, not with his father, alone, in his wedding clothes, the morning suit, the flower in the lapel, standing at the edge of the parking lot where the asphalt met the sidewalk, looking at Maggie with the expression of a man who has just spent the worst 2 hours of his life and has come out on the other side of them having, possibly for the first time in his life, arrived at something true. Maggie stopped. Cole stopped beside her. Douglas looked at Cole. Then he looked at Maggie. He said, "I need to say something." Maggie was very still. Douglas said, "I'm not going to make excuses. I had the whole thing worked out in my head. The explanation, the context, the story about why it was complicated. I spent 2 hours in a room with my father and my best man working on the explanation." He stopped. He looked at the ground. Then he looked back up. He said, "I didn't love you the way you deserve to be loved. I told myself I did. I told myself that what we had was good enough. And that good enough was love. I let you plan a wedding while I was keeping a secret that was going to destroy you. And I told myself I would figure out before it mattered. And I kept telling myself that until this morning when I realized there was no more before it matters, because today was the day." Maggie listened. Douglas said, "You deserve better than me. You deserve someone who would be awake at 3 in the morning because he was afraid you were alone. You deserve someone who would." He looked at Cole. Something in his face when he looked at Cole was complicated and not entirely without dignity. He said, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm genuinely sorry. Not because I got caught. Because I wasn't who I should have been." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "I'm going to handle the legal situation. I want you to know that. The Vivian situation. I'm not going to make it complicated." He turned and walked back toward the building. Maggie watched him go. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, in the September morning, with Cole's hand still in hers. She said, "I didn't expect that." Cole said, "People sometimes surprise you." She said, "Do they usually do it this late?" He said, "Usually, yes." She looked at the building, at the florist vans, at the spot where Douglas had been standing. She said, "Cole." He said, "Yes." She said, "That sentence I never finished." He said, "The one about load-bearing walls." She said, "Yes." "Here's how it ends." She turned to face him. She said, "I was telling you that in architecture, when you take down a wall you thought was holding everything up, and it turns out it wasn't load-bearing after all, what you get isn't collapse. What you get is a better view of what was always there." Cole looked at her. He said nothing. She said, "You were always there." And there, in the parking lot of Hartwell Manor on a Saturday in September, under a sky that had decided to be extraordinarily beautiful about the whole thing, Cole put his other hand against her face the way you cup something that has been lost for a long time and you have just found again, and he said, "I know. I knew the first night." She said, "The coffee." He said, "The coffee." She said, "You need to stop being so smooth about this. It's making it very hard to be appropriately slow about things." He said, "I'll try." She said, "Good." They stood in the September morning. She said, "Buy me coffee." He said, "I thought you'd never ask." And they walked together, finally, with the particular ease of people who have been walking toward the same place for 11 years and have just realized it, down the sidewalk in the direction of St. Anthony's Hospital, in the direction of a coffee shop that stayed open all night, in the direction of a new room with a better view, built on the foundation of every true thing they had ever said and everything they were at last no longer afraid to say. The September morning watched them go. The flowers in the building began to come down, one arrangement at a time, carried out through the service entrance in the same vans that had brought them in. The tables would be cleared. The chairs would be stacked. The beautiful arch at the front of the ballroom, built for a ceremony that had not happened, would be disassembled by careful hands and carried back to wherever it had come from. Diane stood at the service entrance with her clipboard. She watched the last of the decor come out. She made notes. She was a professional, and professionals finished their work regardless. But when the last van pulled away, Diane stood alone in the service entrance for a moment, and she thought about a man in a white shirt with his sleeves rolled up, walking through the doors with a folder, and a woman in a wedding dress sitting on the floor of the Magnolia Suite with her mother. She thought about what it took to do what he had done. Not the money. She had managed enough wealthy clients to be entirely unmoved by money. She thought about the particular kind of courage it took to say, "This matters enough that I am going to do something insane and true, and I am going to show up and tell the truth and then wait, without any promise of how it ends." She closed her clipboard. She went home. Ruth was in her kitchen when her phone rang. She answered it. It was Maggie. It was 6 in the evening, and Maggie sounded different from how she had sounded that morning. Lighter, she thought. Lighter in the specific way of someone who has put down something they had been carrying for a long time. Maggie said, "Mama, I'm at the coffee place. I wanted call." Ruth said, "I know you did. How is the coffee?" Maggie said, "It's the best coffee. It's always the best coffee." Ruth said, "And?" Maggie said, "And we talked for 6 hours." Ruth said, 6 hours is a long time to talk. Maggie said, "There's a lot to say." Ruth said, "I imagine so." Maggie said, "Mama, he paid your bills." Ruth was quiet. Maggie said, "The Mercy General bills. For years ago, he paid them." Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know." Maggie said, "You know?" Ruth said, "I suspected. I looked into it. I found enough to suspect." Maggie said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Ruth said, "Because it wasn't my story to tell him, and I thought if you were ever supposed to know, he would tell you himself." Maggie said, "Mama." Ruth said, "I know, baby." Maggie said, "I don't know what to do with all of this." Ruth said, "Yes, you do. You've known what to do with it since a hospital waiting room when you were 24 years old, and you were alone, and a man brought you coffee that was still warm. You've known the whole time. You just needed the wall to come down." Maggie was quiet. Then she said, "I told him about the load-bearing wall." Ruth said, "What did he say?" Maggie said, "He said he knew, that he'd known since the first night." Ruth made a sound. It was the sound of a woman who has been right about something important for 11 years and has been patient enough to let it prove itself. She said, "You're going to be okay." Maggie said, "I know." Ruth said, "More than okay." Maggie said, "I know that too." She said goodnight. She put the phone down. She looked across the table at Cole, who had been looking at her with particular patient attention she had loved about him since the beginning. The kind that made you feel like the most interesting person in any room. She said, "My mother knew about the payment." He said, "I know." She said, "You knew she knew?" He said, "I suspected." Ruth is, your mother sees things. She said, "She does." She said she's been waiting for 11 years for me to figure out what she figured out in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. He said, "Smart woman." She said, "The smartest." She put her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at him. She said, "Cole, what happens now?" He said, "What do you want to happen?" She said, "I want to finish the coffee. I want to go home and take a bath and think about the fact that I did not get married today and feel everything I need to feel about that. I want to call my best friend and tell her the whole story and let her be appropriately outraged about Douglas and appropriately excited about everything else. I want to sleep for about 10 hours. He said, "Those all sound like good things." She said, "And then I want to see you again. Not for anything big. Not for any conversations about the future or what this means or where it goes. Just for coffee. Just for another one of these." He said, "Just coffee." She said, "For now." "Yes." He said, "I can do that." She said, "Tomorrow?" He said, "Tomorrow." She looked at him. She said, "You should know something. I'm not easy. I'm particular about things. I have opinions about architecture that can go on for a very long time. I'm close with my mother in a way that is going to be very present in any relationship I'm in. I'm still figuring out what I want my life to look like." He said, "I know all of that." She said, "You don't know all of it." He said, "I know enough to know I want to learn the rest." She looked at him. She picked up her coffee. She said, "Cole." He said, "Yes." She said, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and you've been happening to me for 11 years, and I'm done pretending I don't know it." He held his cup up. She held hers up. They clinked. The small ceramic sound of 2 cups in a coffee shop at 6 in the evening, on the other side of the longest Saturday either of them had ever lived. They drank. Outside, the September evening was coming in. The particular amber of September at 6 o'clock, when the light gets low and warm, and does something generous to everything it touches. The coffee shop had been here for all 11 of those years, open all night, dispensing the same extraordinary coffee to night shift nurses and people who couldn't sleep, and a man who had started carrying an extra cup because the woman at the counter always gave him one. He had stopped carrying the extra cup when he moved away. He thought, sitting in the amber September light, that he might start again. Tomorrow they would have coffee. And the day after, and in the weeks that came, the weeks of Maggie extricated herself from 18 months of a life that had been built on a foundation she hadn't known was wrong. The weeks of legal situations and return deposits and very long conversations with her best friend and one very direct conversation with Douglas's attorney that went considerably more smoothly than anyone expected. In all those weeks, Cole was there, not in a way that crowded or rushed or pressed for something to be named before it was ready, in the way of a person who has learned, through a very long and expensive lesson, that the most important thing is presence. He was present. He was simply, consistently, genuinely present in the way he had always been present with her. The full attention, the real listening, the coffee from the right place, the willingness to sit in a waiting room with someone who needed a witness. 6 weeks after the Saturday in September, on a Tuesday evening, they were walking in the park near St. Anthony's Hospital. The same park, the same path. The leaves had turned, because this was a part of the year when leaves do that. They came to the bench. Maggie stopped. Cole stopped beside her. She said, "This bench." He said, "This bench." She said, 11 years ago you asked me what I was thinking." He said, "You said nothing." She said, "I told you what I was really thinking." He said, "In a parking lot, in September." She said, "I want to finish the sentence now. The actual sentence. The one about load-bearing walls." He said, "I'm listening." She sat down on the bench. He sat down beside her. She said, "I was going to say, and this is verbatim, this is exactly what I was going to say before I stopped. I was going to say that I had been thinking about a building I was working on, and how we had been so certain that this particular wall was structural, and we had planned everything around it, and then the engineer came in and said it was just a wall. It was just there, and we could take it down, and when we took it down, the room was twice the size we thought it was, and had windows we didn't even know existed." Cole was quiet. She said, "And I was going to say that I had been thinking about that a lot, about how the things you're most certain are holding everything up are sometimes just walls, and what's actually holding everything up is something you don't even think of as structural, because it's just always been there." She looked at him. She said, "You've always been there." Cole looked at her on the bench in the October park with the turned leaves and the particular quality of autumn afternoon light that does something generous to everything it touches. He said, "You finished the sentence." She said, 11 years later." He said, "Better late." She said, "Considerably better." He took her hand. She led him. They sat on the bench the way they had sat on it 11 years ago, side by side, close enough to be present, in a particular comfortable silence of two people who have figured out that they don't need to fill the space between them with noise. The park was quiet. The leaves were doing their autumn thing. Somewhere a few blocks away, St. Anthony's Hospital was doing its eternal work. The night shifts changing, the waiting rooms filling and emptying, the double doors opening and closing, the whole vast invisible machinery of caring for people who needed to be cared for. Somewhere in that building, at 2 in the morning on a particular cold night 11 years ago, a man had walked through a door carrying 2 cups of coffee and had made a small decision that had turned out to be the largest decision of his life. He had not known that then. He had just seen a woman alone in a room and had thought, "She needs coffee that's still warm." That was the whole thought. That was the whole beginning. He had the rest of his life to tell her so. And this is where the story ends. Not with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration or the particular kind of cinematic inclusion that ties everything in a bow. It ends on a bench in a park in October, with 2 people holding hands, and the leaves doing what leaves do in a coffee shop 3 blocks away getting ready for another night of being exactly what people needed it to be. It ends with the sentence finished. It ends with the wall down. It ends with the room twice the size they thought. It ends with the windows they didn't know existed, letting in the light. That is the story of a man who bought a building to stop a wedding. But you know now that the building was never really the point. The building was just the way the truth arrived. The point was a woman alone in a waiting room at 2 in the morning. The point was a cup of coffee that was still warm. The point was 11 years of loving someone in the particular aching way of people who don't say the thing, and particular grace of still being given the chance to say it. The point is this. Sometimes the most important thing you will ever do is walk through a door. Sometimes it costs more than you planned. Sometimes it costs a building. Sometimes it costs an apology that is 11 years overdue. Sometimes it costs the admission that you were scared, that underneath all the logic of your disappearance, underneath all the reasonable explanations, you were simply a person who loved someone and didn't know how to say so. But you say it. Eventually, if you are lucky, you say it. And if you are very lucky, there is still someone on the other side of the door. For everyone who has ever loved someone in the quiet, for everyone who has carried an extra cup with nowhere to bring it, for everyone who stopped mid-sentence in a park and didn't finish, this story was for you. It's not too late to finish the sentence.